As I examine some of the arguments that have been floated against her nomination over the last several weeks, it's pretty thin gruel. Having said that, I expect that my Republican colleagues and my Democratic colleagues should ask her tough questions.
Tough questions there will be as Elena Kagan's confirmation hearings kick off today in the Senate.
The Senate lost one of its true giants today. Top Line begins right now.
Good afternoon and welcome to ABC News Washington Post Top Line. I'm Rick Klein.
And I'm Jonathan Karl.
Every day at noon Eastern, we're right here bringing you the latest political news and analysis, everything you need to know about a busy, busy day in politics. More is at Twitter. We're twitter.com/The Note. And John, I know you're on Capitol Hill today where the Kagan hearings kick off in just a little bit, so kick us off.
But today it starts with Robert Byrd, rest in peace. The Senate's longest serving member ever, Robert C. Byrd, died at 3 o'clock in the morning. This truly is a loss for the Senate, Rick. Senator Byrd I interviewed several years ago. I asked him how long he would serve as a senator. He said until he breathed his last breath, and then he suggested that could be a long time. He pointed out to me that Noah lived until he was 950 years old. Byrd didn't last quite that long, but he sure had an impact on this place.
No question, and you're right. He served up until the very end, served faithfully, served loyally, had that copy of the Constitution in his pocket. We can all remember those speeches about spring and about his dog, and just a tremendous loss for the United States Senate. Coming on the heels of the loss of Ted Kennedy, the institutional memory that we've lost over the past year is really stunning. Next up, thin gruel. That's President Obama's description of the case against Elena Kagan. Nonetheless, it will be that gruel that is gnashed over and over again during confirmation hearings that begin this afternoon. We'll hear from Elena Kagan today. We know really the basic areas of inquiry the Republicans are likely to tread, John, and they don't rule out a filibuster, but it is hard to imagine anything keeping her from joining the Supreme Court.
That's right, Rick. In fact, Democrats, the White House, are more confident that Kagan will be confirmed even than they were that Sotomayor would be confirmed, and they were quite confident back then. But interestingly, you'll probably see a situation here where Republicans are even more dug in than they were against Sotomayor. You probably will see more no votes for Kagan. Next up, Great Scott. Check this out. Scott Brown now appears to be the most popular politician in the state of Massachusetts. His popularity, his approval rating higher than Barack Obama, higher than John Kerry. But more interestingly is the disapproval rating. Only 18% disapprove of Scott Brown compared to 41% for Barack Obama, 37% for John Kerry. That's in today's Boston Globe. Now, Rick, who would have thought that at this point a Republican would be the most popular political figure in Massachusetts?
And even people in Massachusetts that said that they were not confident about his political prospects. They thought people would get to know him and not like what they see. Now we're seeing a glimpse of why he's been so often number 60, breaking the Republican-led filibusters, and less often number 41, joining them. With that actually leads us to our final top line today, and it is reg reform with a question mark, suddenly a question mark, and that's because the votes don't look like they're there, with Senator Byrd's passing and now Scott Brown saying that he is reconsidering his support for financial regulatory reform. We saw the conference committee report back last week, a negotiation between the House and the Senate, but to get 60 votes in the Senate suddenly looks very, very difficult, John, and as of today, they're just not there.
Yeah, they're almost certainly going to have to wait until Robert Byrd's appointment, his replacement is nominated or appointed by the governor of West Virginia. But Scott Brown is saying that in that conference committee, they added $18 billion in fees and taxes on banks. And he hasn't said definitely he'll vote no, but he says, I have never said I would vote for a tax increase. So now we are joined by our guest right now, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democratic senator from the great state of Rhode Island. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you, Jonathan.
And before we get to and you're also a member of the Judiciary Committee, so I want to talk to you about Elena Kagan, but before we get to that confirmation process, Robert Byrd, you must have a good Byrd story or two. What was it like when you came in here? You got elected in 2006, sworn in 2007. What was your interaction with Robert Byrd like?
Well, Reverent, I suppose would be the best way to describe it. He had been in Congress longer than I've been alive. He has served in the Senate for a quarter of the history of the Republic. He is the greatest proponent and embodiment of the Senate as an institution. And so he was very hard to have a normal conversation with. He was somebody who, when you were speaking to, you felt You are sort of engaging with history and not just with a colleague.
Receiving wisdom.
Senator Whitehouse, I want to turn your attention to the confirmation hearings that are about to begin. And again, as a member of the Judiciary Committee, you've watched these hearings close at hand, including the Sotomayor hearing last year. We always hear the same complaints, that these hearings are hollow and vapid, and that's actually quoting Elena Kagan, and it's only gotten worse in recent years. What can you do, what can Democrats on the committee do to make sure that these are actually interesting and engaging and important hearings?
Well, I think one of the things we can do is to try to rebut the Republican hearing strategy, which, completely independent of trying to attack the president's nominee, is to reinforce the notion that the mainstream happens to coincide with the Republican ideological mainstream, and that it's the Democrats who are activists and not the Republicans. It'll be interesting to watch them try to make that latter point in the wake of today's Supreme Court decision, finding for the first time in the history of the country that there's an independent right to bear arms as applied to states and to municipalities that for decades have regulated firearms. So the activism chord is one that they're going to have to play with a little bit of irony to it today, I think.
But don't you have an obligation on the committee to try to pin her down to a degree? I mean, she comes in with very little record. We know very little about where she stands on controversial issues like the Second Amendment, abortion. Don't you need to somehow try to get a better understanding of her judicial philosophy? I'm sure that the hearing will take us through a great number of areas of important judicial philosophy. The one thing you have to watch for in these discussions is if you get close to the point where it looks as if you're prepared to trade your vote for the nominee's commitment to vote a certain way in a later decision, right, it has now become an abuse of the committee process, and you want to avoid that. So broad issues about philosophy and about the institution and structure of our government, absolutely. Pinning down to individual cases and seeking pledges and commitments, out of bounds.
Senator, I want to ask you about one particular point that we're hearing from Republicans. They're pointing out that Elena Kagan has a very political background. Working in the White House, was involved in a lot of Clinton-era political battles. She also got her start as an opposition researcher in the Dukakis campaign. Now, you've been critical of people with these hyper-political backgrounds in the past, including Tim Griffin when he was up to be U.S. attorney under President Bush. Is that legitimate to look at political views and to hone in on that as the Republicans look like they're likely to do this week?
Yeah, I think it clearly is a legitimate topic of inquiry, and I'm sure it'll be well ventilated. Obviously, when one serves in the White House counsel office, there are political aspects to that, and I'm sure that she has rendered decisions for her White House client that had that necessary political overtone. The key question isn't did she do that? That's just being a good lawyer in those circumstances. The key question is, now that she's a nominee for the Supreme Court, will she do what Supreme Court justices should, set that aside and make her decision based on the law and based on the Constitution?
Senator, I'd like to switch gears and ask you about Afghanistan before you leave. You're a member of the Intelligence Committee. You've traveled to Afghanistan. In the wake of the change of leadership command out there with General Petraeus coming in, just wondering if you have concerns about the way things are going and about the length of our commitment in Afghanistan.
I think, there's obvious concern that the military effort is not being more rapid and successful. There is considerable concern about President Karzai and the level of corruption in his administration. I think there is going to be a period of adjustment as General Petraeus comes in and establishes his working relationships with Ambassador Eikenberry and others. But I think we should let the administration get through that period before we go to final judgment in any of these other areas.
Do you need more specificity on the July 2011 deadline for troop withdrawals?
Well, I think to allow the president some judgment and some room to maneuver around that date, I think is wise. Exactly who gets drawn down at that stage and how that process goes forward, I think is something that we should evaluate on an ongoing basis rather than try to pin the president down in advance. He needs to have the full flexibility within that set of parameters to make the right decision.
All right, Senator Sheldon, Whitehouse, thank you very much for joining us here on Top Line.
Thank you. Good to be with you on Top Line.
And thank you, Senator.